In this lesson, I want to walk through another example of a data provider component we could build. So you can see here I've got these two profile cards. We've got one sort of horizontal layout and another stacked layout. Now, a common complaint about traditional media queries is that they only let you change how an element looks based on the size of the viewport, when most of the time what you really want is to change how an element looks based on the size of the element itself. For example, this top profile card, the horizontal layout, we might want this to collapse down to a stacked layout once we get below, say, 400 pixels before things start to wrap and start getting really ugly. Let's try and write a data provider component that can help us get around this limitation of media queries. So check out this library here. It's called Element Resize Detector. It's a fairly popular library for being able to detect when an element's size changes in the browser. The way it works is pretty simple. You just need to pull it in via npm. You create an instance of the Element Resize Detector, and then you use that Element Resize Detector to listen to a particular DOM element and run a callback anytime it notices that the size of that element has changed. Let's try and use this to create a data provider component that we can use to get access to the dimensions of the current element. Let's head over to our editor and create a new component. I'm going to create a new file in our components directory here, and I'm going to call this component withDimensions.vue because it's sort of a wrapper component that we're going to be able to put around another element to give that element access to its own dimensions. Let's scaffold out a new Vue component here. We can get rid of the template because this is going to be a renderless component that just uses a render function. Let's get rid of the props since we don't need those, and we also don't need the methods section, so we'll delete that as well. Let's add our render function, and we'll just have this render function return the default scoped slot, invoking that, passing through some slot props that we'll figure out in a minute. Next, let's go ahead and import this library. I've already installed it via npm, so all we have to do is import it here. So I'm going to import Element Resize Detector Maker from Element Resize Detector. And now we can use this maker function to create an actual instance of a resize detector. So let's go ahead and create an ERD here, an element resize detector, by invoking the element resize detector maker, passing through any options. So by default, this will use an object-based strategy for detecting when an element is resized, but the library also supports a scroll strategy, which it claims is a lot faster and is going to be the default in future versions. So let's just use that. Next, we need to set this up to listen for when our element is resized. So since we need access to the actual DOM element, we can do this in our mounted callback. So let's add a mounted function here. And inside of this, we can use ERD to listen to the root element of this component, which we can access through this.$L, and then we can pass through a callback that receives the element anytime its size changes. So how about whenever this callback runs, we keep track of the element's new width and height and store that in our data property. Let's add a width property here. We'll set it to null, and a height property that we set to null since we don't know the element's dimensions initially. Now down here in this callback, we can set this.width equals L.offset width, and we can set this.height to equal L.offset height. Now in our render function, we can pass this information through the scoped slot so the parent has access to the element's dimensions. So why don't we pass through width as this.width and height as this.height. Let's try and pull in this component in app.vue and see if everything's actually going to work. So I'm going to head down to the bottom here, and why don't we just go ahead and import with dimensions from .components/withDimensions.vue. And let's just go ahead and make sure that we register this component so we can use it in our template. Let's head up to the top here and let's wrap this profile card in an instance of our withDimensions component. So I'm going to say withDimensions. Let's go ahead and close that off. And now we can access the width and height of this element by destructuring it out of the slot scope. So let's grab maybe just the width for now, since that's all I think we're actually going to need. Now, why don't we go ahead and remove this profile card horizontal class for now, and we'll just have two instances of the same card. Both are using the stacked layout, but one is a lot wider and the other one's a lot narrower. So if we only wanted to add that profile card horizontal class back whenever the width was greater than, say, 400 pixels, we can totally do that by just adding a class binding. So why don't we say class equals, and then we use object syntax here to specify that we want to add the profile card horizontal class whenever the width is greater than or equal to 400 pixels. And hey, it actually looks like it's already working. We're seeing the horizontal layout. Let's go over to the DevTools here and just grab a hold of this div and manipulate the width in DevTools to kind of see what happens. So let's pull it down to 410, still horizontal, 400, and now the element jumps to the stacked layout. And that's because the element is actually only 399 pixels wide since we have these left and right borders on the wrapper element. So we can keep shrinking this down, and it stays at the stacked layout. But if we get above 400 pixels, well, all of a sudden we jump back to the horizontal layout. Pretty cool, right? Now, the cool thing about what we've done here is that this is actually a lot more powerful than just regular media queries. Because with regular media queries, the only thing that you can change is CSS. But here, we can actually change anything about this component based on the width. If we wanted to, we could change the person's name based on the width. We could say, if the width is greater than 400, well, then we want the person's name to be Toby Flenderson. Otherwise, we want the person's name to be Andy Bernard. And now if we go ahead and check out what we've done here, if I change the width of this, as it gets smaller, well, now the person's name changes. So that's a lot more than you can just do with CSS. Something else that's neat about this approach is we can actually bake this with dimensions component into a new component like profile card so that any consumers don't even have to know about changing the element's style based on its size. Let's take a look at what that would look like. I'm going to create a new component here in components. We'll call it profile card.view. We'll scaffold out a new Vue component here, and let's just go ahead and paste in all the markup that we have out here. I'm going to take in everything, including the with dimensions component. I'm going to paste it inside of this template. Let's go ahead and grab our import here and pull that in as well. Actually, let's go ahead and grab this whole component definition. So we'll just grab all this stuff and replace it with this. Get rid of this unnecessary part of the path. Save this file, and then let's head back to app.vue and import this component. So let's go ahead and import profile card here and make sure that we register that with our app component. Now if we head up to the top here, we can get rid of this entirely, and we can just throw in an instance of profile card. We can do the same thing down here. So let's just throw in another profile card here. And now if we head over to the browser and try to make some changes to the size of the containing element, you can see we've got like an automatically responsive component here where the parent component doesn't even have to know that the design of that component is going to change based on the amount of space available to it. It's all sort of neatly encapsulated inside that component.